All right, for this little talk, we're going to get into a little bit about synthesis. And we're going to use Maximus P as the backdrop for demonstrations because Maximus P has the ability to show synthesis as like a flowchart. So if you were to get into textbooks on synthesis, you would see things like unit operators or unit generators that connect together in a flowchart such that you have, like, let's say an oscillator, and then you have something that represents a filter, and then you have something that maybe represents an amplifier. And each of these things affect the sound in a particular way, whether it's generating the sound or manipulating the sound downstream. In the case of Maximus P, we have the same kind of idea. We actually will connect modules together with wires. In this case, we have ourselves a sine wave generator. We're going to do some math on that sine wave. We're going to actually multiply it by a number such that if you multiply a waveform by 1, it's going to equal itself. If you multiply it by 0, it cancels out the amplitude altogether. If you multiply it by 0.5, it reduces the amplitude by half. These sort of simple things here. And then we're going to send it somewhere useful that I'm able to display some things. So we'll display things over in these displays here. We'll have an oscilloscope style reading. It's not perfect, but it's ballpark. And we'll have a spectrum reading, two versions. One that's like the full frequency range and one that's just the lower frequencies, hopefully to be able to see some things with a little more clarity. I will live in this little square here. You can probably see my face at this point. And what else do you need to know about this interface? I think that's the main stuff. All right, let's jump into this main one. The first one we have here is additive synthesis. So the idea of additive synthesis, you start with multiple sine waves and you add them all together, and you have each sine wave has two controls. You have the frequency and some variation of amplitude or intensity or level or whatever you want to call it. The cool thing about additive synthesis, and we talked about this a little bit in the sound demonstrations, is that you can represent any sound on Earth with the right combination of sinusoids. You would need close to infinite sinusoids to really represent anything other than periodic sounds, but it's potential that if you had infinite sinusoids and an infinite mixer, you could combine sinusoids to get different tones and some tones and such that you get all of the possible sounds. Now, you would have to be able to manipulate this mixer at incredible speeds to get everything to operate perfectly, but that's really what you can do with Fourier analysis and resynthesis. So our additive synthesizer, we did a little bit of a demonstration with that, with a little more voices. As you can see, to get more voices, I need to take up screen real estate with here's one voice, here's another voice, another voice, another voice. I'm only going to show things with 4 voices because after that it gets ridiculous. So we have in this example 4 voices summed together. I'm going to do things with presets so you can hear things very quickly. We have a kind of a sawtooth wave preset here that has the harmonic series with its appropriate amplitude variations for each voice. And then a sort of a square wave. Oh, it did actually draw a square wave this time. Beautiful. That is the odd harmonics. So if we start at 110 hertz, the A, we get the other frequencies here. And it's going to have that the volume changes in proportion to the frequency. So a fundamental, full volume, the next harmonic, 3 times the frequency, 1/3 the volume, and so on and so forth. We can also get all sorts of other weird sounds just by slamming sine waves together. You know, you can get wobbly kind of things by having slightly detuned sine waves. That can get more severe. You can get kind of a trancey effect if you get really deep into this. Then you can get all sorts of just wobbly, oddball things where it kind of drifts about. And this is something that's kind of cool that you can do with Max in particular, is that you can detune each voice of your synthesizer and get some slight variations in the upper harmonics where things are kind of wiggling a little bit. All right, so that's additive synthesis. It's pretty cool stuff, except there's the problem of control, right? I was using presets because, my goodness, can you imagine how long it would take me to enter in all these numbers? in a real additive synthesizer context where it's not just 4 voices, but it's like dozens, if not 50 voices. If you look deep inside of some of your Ableton things like Operator and some of these other tools, they actually have like multiple voices. Now, you can't manipulate their pitch independent of each other, but you can at least manipulate the volume relative to each other. So if we want to make a complex sound, because that's ultimately what we're after, right? When we add sine waves together, sine waves are relatively boring. If we add a lot of sine waves together, we get a complex sound. Great. Why don't we just start with a complex sound and then take away what we don't want? Because that's precisely what we do in something called subtractive synthesis. So in subtractive synthesis, you start with a lot of complex waves. It could be a square wave, but in this case, I'm going to use noise as an example. And then you, instead of combining things to get a more complex wave, we want to get less complex actually. So we start using like a filter. In this case, I'll use a low pass filter. In fact, I'll use a resonant low pass filter. So I get a little bit of resonance and it becomes pitched. And then of course I can then probably want to change the amplitude a little bit, as the problem when I start resonating things is I start getting like peaky amplitude, like it's going to get a little loud, and I don't want to do that, especially in the recording, because it might get noisy. So let's jump into subtractive synthesis. In this case, we have noise going into a resonant low pass filter. So this is going to be just white noise, broad bandwidth sound. This guy is a low pass filter that's going to do 2 things. I'm going to be able to change the cutoff frequency, so what frequencies above will not pass and frequencies below will be allowed to pass. But I'm going to do something very particular, as I'm going to resonate those frequencies, particularly the cutoff frequency, so that it becomes a bit of a pitched sound. Now it's being driven by noise, so it's going to have some variations in the quality. So again, I did some presets just for kind of speed here. So first preset is just off. Second preset is we have a resonant. It's almost like, it's a lot like a sine wave, right? Except for it's not stable. It's kind of wiggling. You know, hopefully that makes it a little bit interesting. But let's try some other presets where we reduce the resonance a little bit. Oh, now it's not so pitched, is it? Right? It's still a sense of pitch. But as we reduce the resonance, it's less pitchy. And this is another one. Here we have something that's 440. This is like the 2 octaves above middle C. That's an A. And as we get resonant, this might get a little loud. I apologize in advance if it's distorted. Right, it gets closer and closer to a pitch. There we go, it's starting to pitch. And it's really loud, yeah? Because that's being driven pretty hard. But you can hear now with subtractive synthesis that we have the ability to have a more complex variation in the wave, even if it sounds somewhat like sinusoids. The sinusoids aren't stable. It creates a little bit of interest, a little bit of complexity, something that will hopefully be musically interesting. Now, this is probably the most boring example possible, but I just wanted to show you the context of which you start with noise, any noise, frankly, and you resonate it until it becomes something that's of pitched material, which you can then drop into a synthesizer or a sampler and play melodies and bass lines and these sorts of things with these somewhat pitched sounds. All right, let's jump into another one. Now, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because it's a little easier to talk about amplitude modulation. So amplitude modulation is where we modulate, as in change over time, the amplitude. Right? Okay, we've just used the words that are in the title to define it. Well, amplitude modulation is varying the volume, right? And we have tremolo that varies the volume. Let's just play a simple sine wave with a slow moving volume change, something you could do with a fader even. So it's like moving a fader once per second from full volume to 0 again. 2 hertz. We can go much faster. Oh, once we start getting the teens, we get a little bit of a different effect. Let's go to 20 hertz. Oh, now we start to get a little bit of a chord. 55, it's really pronounced. Oh, now we're getting somewhere. So let's start playing with those chords. And 1 So we're hearing, in this case, 3 voices, even though we have 2 sine waves. We have the carrier tone, the original frequency that's playing. This guy here is the original frequency. Let me just turn this off. This guy's the original frequency. It's being modulated. Its amplitude is being modulated by this frequency. And when they have a certain ratios, 1/6, 1/3, 1/5, and these sorts, we actually get some like of these neat little chords. But either way, what's always present is, can I turn down the volume? I can leave it displaying and not have sound. Great. When we turn down, when we really manipulate the volume severely, we get those other tones. I'm going to go to a higher amplitude so we can see the 3 frequencies. Now when I switch to bipolar, because it goes negative and positive, one of those frequencies is going to be like a sum tone that is the carrier positive and the carrier negative. They're going to be phase inverted relative to each other. So they're going to cancel out. So let's do that. And boom, that 220 hertz just disappeared. So now I just have these sum and difference tones. So it's the carrier, the modulator plus the carrier, and the modulator minus the carrier. So again, this sounds like, you know, a simple chord. So this is, oh, I want to keep that on, but keep the sound down. I think unipolar is probably the most interesting when we're working with just sine waves, because I get 2 in and 3 out. That's kind of exciting. Now we can use ring modulation as an audio effect. You can actually put in any signal and multiply it by a sine wave or any other wave and get very much more complex things. So every 2 frequencies that go in unipolar amplitude modulation, you get 3 frequencies out. In ring modulation, you get 2 frequencies out, and those frequencies are relative to the modulator, summing the context of the contents of your carrier signal by the modulator. Let's turn that back up. So we've heard tremolo. We've heard if you take tremolo up into the audio rate, so we're modulating that amplitude severely, you get some more complex tones. But where it gets really interesting, at least in terms of complexity, is in frequency modulation, because we're doing, we're taking, you know, our sine wave again, and instead of turning the volume up and down, it's like we're turning the frequency knob, the pitch knob of the oscillator at audio rates. So at first, that's going to sound like vibrato. It's going to sound like when you stop a string and you modulate the pitch by shaking your body in some way. You know, it goes a little bit sharp, it goes a little bit flat around a center pitch. That's awesome and musical, and actually kind of makes rather simple sine waves just a little bit more interesting. So let's listen to this guy. He's playing, we've got ourselves a 100 hertz carrier modulated by a very low frequency, so very small modulation. You know, we might actually modulate it just a few hertz, right? You know, this kind of sounds like, actually, vibrato, in musical vibrato is usually between 5 and 7 hertz. I'll do 6, right? And it might not be so severe. It might not be that large of a variation. Now, let's go up to a higher frequency so we can hear it. Right, you hear that kind of Wurlitzer sound there. A little bit of vibrato there. Now this can get very exciting when we start playing with the ratio between the carrier and the modulator frequency. So in this case, I'm playing with this. Oh, I don't like that one. I'm playing with the ratio. So at a 50% ratio, you get a cool chord. At 0.66, you get another kind of cool chord. And then you get something a little sawtooth-like out of just 2 oscillators. So rather than a whole bunch of oscillators, I just have 2 oscillators and I get a sawtooth-like sound, which is kind of nice. I can even get a slight square wave type quality sound, again, out of just 2 oscillators. Now, we can do really severe audio effects with this too. really dig getting a slightly more complex sound with so little computational power. You know, that's the thing that's sort of interesting about FM synthesis versus some more complex synthesis is the demands on my computer are a lot less. So if I want to have a lot of voices and I have a lot of other processing I need to be doing, there's something really elegant about FM synthesis for getting complexity without a lot. And it's also somewhat easy to control. I mean, you can sit here and play around with these three parameters, the modulation frequency. That's the frequency at which we are changing the pitch of the carrier. But one of the numbers that's kind of interesting is how much do you modulate that frequency? If you modulate it just a little bit, right, that sounds like vibrato, especially if it's at the right kind of musical speed. If you modulate it a lot, you get that weird siren effect where it's just like, woo, woo, it's like all over the place. And when you start working with the ratio between the modulator and the carrier, you can get some more interesting harmonic timbres. You know, you heard those like very chord-like sounds, even though we're only using 2 notes. So those are the 4 areas of synthesis that I wanted to make sure you guys heard and knew some of the language, some of the terms, because when you jump into various toolkits out there, it's really these are the 4 main synthesis toolkits. For this segment, we're going to talk a little bit about amplitude envelopes. In particular, kind of musical amplitude envelopes. Previously, we talked about steady state synthesis. So you start a tone, it happens over time. It's pretty constant. Now we're going to look at how do we trigger that thing? Because maybe not all of our performance aesthetics involve drones that go on indefinitely. So first one, let's get a tone that's happening. Let's go ahead and turn on this FM synth for a second. Let's get this tone I kind of want to hear for a while, especially one that my voice can fit over if we're playing them both at the same time. So right now we have it constant. So as I make changes, you would hear them, and that's all awesome and stuff. But for now, I want to make it go away. And now I want to start applying amplitude envelopes to the overall sound. So the first kind of amplitude envelope is something that we'd use from kind of the sampling exercise, where there's a fade in time when the sound starts, and then when it's time for the sound to end, there's a fade out time. It's a very simple attack release envelope. So we'll just fade in, fade out. Right. Another kind is a little more complex than that, and it's mimicking kind of musical tones. So in a musical tone, like I'm thinking of a piano in particular, there is the onset, we press the key, there's an onset, it's rather sharp, and then it kind of fades away for a little bit, not all the way out, just fades a little bit, and then it gets us into a steady state tone that's for a while. It's not perfectly steady, but it's relatively steady over time, and then when you release the key, it fades away. This is called an attack, so that's the fade in part. Decay, so that's when it goes from its highest amplitude down to a steady state tone. Sustain, at what level does it sustain at? And then release, how long does it take to fade away? Your sustain portion can also, instead of holding at a perfect place, it can do like a slow fade. So let's have ourselves a little ADSR action here. Right, and we can manipulate things like the slope of some of these things. We can even have more complex envelopes. You know, and a lot of folks using FM kind of sounds will do more of a, they'll get rid of the D and S part altogether and just have a slow fade in. Right, so every synthesizer that you're going to run into is going to have some aspect of this. Where it gets even more exciting is when you start doing things like taking that particular modulation and then putting it somewhere where you can control something else. Like I'm going to receive that envelope. Let's see if I can type receive. Cool. Yeah, I can't type it. It's I before E except after C. So EI, that's the one I'm looking for. And I'm going to have to take a snapshot of that thing. So I'm going to take snapshot. Let's be really quick about this. Let's do 10. And then I'm going to manipulate, What would be fun? How about the CM ratio? So now when I trigger this envelope, it's not only going to trigger the amplitude envelope over time, it's going to trigger the timbre change over time as well. Let's see what that sounds like. So that gets kind of neat. So not only we're getting a volume change over time, we're getting a timbre change over time. Now, if I was being like super awesome, I would actually go ahead and create another envelope. We'll call this envelope 2, and we're going to send it from the AR. And we're going to change this because reality is in a more complex synthesizer, you don't use the same envelope for everything. Maybe in a wobble bass, but other than a very specific sound design thing, you'll have one envelope triggering the overall sound and another envelope triggering sounds, timbre changes within the sound. So I'm going to just make a trigger that triggers both of these envelopes at the same time, and let's see what that sounds like. Ooh, nice. All right, so now we're getting some complex changes over time. Now let's start with a more complex frequency range. Ooh, is that the one? Yeah. So right away, we're getting more complex sounds that are changing over time. These examples I just kind of threw together really fast. They're maybe not as musical as what you would want them to be, but very quickly, like if I take this thing over the whole screen and start really building out more complex waves, this works while I'm using sends and receives. I'm using a different kind of control mechanism. When you open up your operator or massive or what's that popular one? Serum. These tools all use the same kind of idea of you have modulation, you have filters, you have envelopes. And some envelopes are just repeating envelopes like low frequency oscillators, LFOs, that just kind of go over time. And some of them are triggerable envelopes that you fire in musical time. So let's see here. Let's take this guy and go down here and say, maybe I don't want to start at 0. I want to start somewhere else. I want to start up at a higher frequency. This function generator lets me do that nicely. And the sustain I want to have change the most. Oops. I've got to shift click to make them go away. All right, maybe that wasn't the shape. Maybe I want to have it. Now maybe I can even change my fade time so it just sounds indefinitely but fades out. Right away I'm getting significant changes to the sound. The sounds are changing over time. And ideally we're getting something musical out of this. Right? This is where the actual like kind of creative sound design comes in, is how do you tie these envelopes together? How do we manipulate them over time to get musical results that are kind of interesting to us? Again, I'm focusing on trying to explain these things, so I'm not picking out the most musical, inspirational sounds, but hopefully you'll get the basic illustration here that you can then apply to your music and your sound design. All right, let's save this and get to it.